30 and go to like
Hi everyone. Oh, sorry.
I'll tell you my idea later.
Thank you all for attending this evening's lecture about Brca genetics and hereditary cancer in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. I would like to welcome Melissa Rosen and Peggy Cottrell, who have come to present from Sharsheret tonight. Melissa is Sharsheret's Director of National Outreach, has a master's degree in Jewish Communal Service from Brandeis University, and has been working in the nonprofit sector for over 25 years. Her professional experience includes informal education, advocacy, and community outreach. Melissa's work has allowed her to facilitate unique and lasting connections among organizations in the diverse American Jewish community. Melissa oversees outreach efforts throughout the country, amplifying Sharsheret's reach and connecting as many as possible to the support and resources of Sharsheret. Herself a breast cancer survivor, she is passionate about the Jewish community and cancer support and advocacy. Peggy is the Genetics Program Coordinator, a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College Master of Science in Genetic Counseling Program. At Sharsheret, Peggy consults with women and families and answers individual questions about their family histories, Brca mutations, and personal risks of hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, and contributes to the development and implementation of Sharsheret's hereditary cancer resources and programs.
Excuse me, could you just say what Sharsheret is, because I don't know.
I'm going to start out that way.
Oh, okay, because she keeps mentioning it and I don't know.
That's the first thing we're going to do.
Okay.
Just a reminder to everybody, some quick housekeeping. Before you leave, please make sure to fill out one of our activity evaluation forms and make sure that you've all signed in the attendance form. And without further ado, please welcome Melissa and Peggy.
Thank you. I'm going to try this without the microphone, but if somebody can't hear me, please let me know. So, tonight's program is all about BRCA genetics and hereditary cancer in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. What that really means is someone who has ancestry from Jewish ancestry from Eastern Europe. Surprisingly, that's a much broader group than people realize because over the generations there has been a lot of intermarriage, and of course, the same mutations we're talking about tonight are also present in the non-Ashkenazi Jewish population, just in smaller numbers. So you ask what Sharsheret is. Sharsheret is a national nonprofit organization that provides free support to women and their families facing breast cancer, ovarian cancer, BRCA or similar mutations. We're the only organization in North America that provides culturally meaningful support to the Jewish community, but our programs are open to everyone, and about a quarter of our callers have no connection to Judaism. We've been around for close to 20 years at this point. We are in the middle of our second collaborative agreement with the CDC, the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We also have a seat on the Federal Advisory Committee for Breast Cancer in Young Women. We're represented in every state at this point. So we really, in close to 20 years, have made a lot of inroads. And like I said, we're the only organization that provides that culturally meaningful support. We do that through community education, like events like this, cultural competency trainings. We teach healthcare providers how to look at their patients, not just as cancer patients, but to take into account other factors such as religion and culture. We do patient education programs in hospitals and doctors' offices. We have some amazing educational resources, some of which are on the table right by the sign-ins and evaluations that I encourage you to grab. And we provide free psychosocial or emotional support through our team of clinicians. And we'll go into the programs a little bit more after we talk about genetics. So the importance of cultural competency. So I told you that we're the only organization that provides this for the Jewish community in North America. But there are other organizations that do similar things for other minority communities, because the reality is that everybody, no matter their illness, no matter where they come from, deserves culturally competent support through their cancer experience. So Sharsheret does it for the Jewish community and beyond. There's an organization called Sisters Network that does it for African American women and beyond. We all go kind of hit our target audience and help anyone else. The interesting thing about culturally meaningful support is that it actually impacts healing. So study after study has shown that patients whose non-medical needs are met have better medical outcomes. So when we think of non-medical needs, what do we think of? We think of finances and childcare, meals, rides to treatment, but we also need to include in that religion and culture. So when we meet somebody's needs where they're at, the studies show they have heightened immune responses. They get through treatment with fewer complications. They not only survive but thrive. And so that's why this kind of support is so necessary. Another question we get quite frequently is, why do we need a Jewish organization? There are so many amazing cancer organizations out there. Komen is one, Gilda's Club's another, so many. And there are two reasons. So one that we're going to focus on tonight is really our hereditary predisposition to certain mutations that raise the risk of cancer. And the other is culturally meaningful education and support, which we just spoke about. So I want to remind you that we're talking about something, a mutation within the Jewish community. And very often, whether someone is Jewish or not Jewish, when you say the Jewish community, you have a certain image in your mind, right? Whether, whoever it is, the healthcare provider, the patient, a friend. So this slide, really, I want to be clear, shows so many different ways that there are to be Jewish, but all of the people there, or most of the people there, have genetic predispositions to this. The reason it's important is something that I think is fascinating. A healthcare provider or a client, a member here, two of them could have two needs regarding to get through their cancer experience, two very specific needs, both related to being Jewish, but completely different from one another. And I think it's very important for us to remember that no matter how someone defines themselves, it could mean a whole lot of different things, and that every individual is really different and has a unique cancer experience and unique needs to get through that experience. Oh, this way. Okay, so a very quick introduction to what Peggy's really going to explain in depth. So we said there's a genetic predisposition. 1 in 40 Jews of Ashkenazi descent, or people of Ashkenazi descent, carry a mutation on one of their BRCA genes. 1 in 40. Men and women. In the general community, if you took, the island of Manhattan, men, women, Jews, Muslims, Christians, everyone, that number is anywhere between 1 in 500 to 1 in 800. So we're at more than 10 times the risk for one of these mutations. And if you carry one of these mutations, you have a lifetime risk of being diagnosed with breast cancer of about up to 88%, depending on the exact mutation, and as much as 45% for ovarian cancer. So that's a significant risk. And one more thing I'm going to say before I hand the podium over to Peggy. So there is so many myths and so much misinformation out there. So I just want to go over a few of the myths, and then Peggy is going to explain why all of these things are wrong and really explain the truth. So you may have heard someone say, oh, I have Brca. The reality is we all have BRCA. We all have 2 BRCA genes. And the purpose of those genes is to suppress excess cell growth, which is, of course, what cancer is, right? So having Brca, so to speak, isn't the problem. It's having a mutation on one of those 2 genes. The other thing is, it's not just BRCA mutations. There are other genetic mutations that may not be as prevalent, but also raise the risk. Peggy's going to talk about some of those. One thing that really upsets me is when people assume this is a woman's issue, a woman's mutation. You heard me say men and women. So sometimes we still get callers at Sharsheret who will say, but my doctor said to me I didn't need to be screened because all the cancer was on my father's side of the family. This is not a woman's mutation. Men and women carry these mutations in equal numbers and pass them down to both their male and female children in equal numbers. And then the final myth that I wanted to go over was the differences in the way some mutations work. So in the Jewish community in particular, we've been very good about educating about a disease called Tay-Sachs. And most people prior to their marriage find out whether they're a carrier of Tay-Sachs before they want to have children. We've done a great job of lowering those rates to almost 0% in the Jewish community because we're so well aware of it. So much so that people sometimes have a hard time understanding that other mutations work differently. So a Tay-Sachs mutation is a recessive mutation, which means that both parents need to carry it and pass it down at the same time for a child to be impacted. It also means that the carrier will never personally be medically impacted. But BRCA mutations are dominant mutations, which means that only one parent needs to carry it, and that parent will pass it on 50% of the time they have children. It also means that they may be medically impacted themselves. So thankfully, we have with us a genetic counselor who really understands the amazing nuances of these mutations and can really explain them in a way far better than I can. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Peggy, and then when she's done, we'll circle back around for some other stuff. But by the way, if anybody has any questions during any part of our presentation, we'll answer at the end, but please feel free to just raise your hand and interrupt during the presentation as well. Thanks.
So who's at risk to develop breast cancer? So we say that probably about 1 in 8 women in the United States will get breast cancer sometime in their life, and that's a lot. And men have a much smaller chance to get breast cancer. Men do get breast cancer, their chance is more like 1 in 800 or 1 in 1,000. So we're really the ones who are dealing with this risk for breast cancer. So breast cancer is common, so we often talk to a lot of women. Most of the time, breast cancer is not inherited. It happens for reasons we can't explain. But since this is Gilda's Club, we're going to talk about ovarian cancer. Ovarian cancer is more rare, only about 1 in 70 women, and that's about 1 or 2% of women will get ovarian cancer sometime in their life. And we talk about breast and ovarian cancer together because these are the 2 cancers that are often inherited together with mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. Question or no? Okay. BRCA1 and 2 don't increase the risk for colon cancer, but I mention colon cancer nonetheless because it's another type of cancer that has a tendency to be inherited. And about 1 in 18 people in the United States, and that's about 5 or 6% of people will get colon cancer. Most of the time, colon cancer is also not inherited, but the amazing thing about colon cancer is that many cases of colon cancer can be actually prevented by screening. And so I never fail to take the opportunity to mention the importance of getting a colonoscopy. And you might have reasons based on family history or other issues to have a colonoscopy at a younger age or more often, but generally we say a person should get their first colonoscopy somewhere around 45 or 50 according to national guidelines. And a colonoscopy, when polyps are removed, those polyps then, because they're removed, are prevented from ever becoming colon cancer, and that's why a colonoscopy is such a very, very important exam to have done. So, as I said already, most of the time when people get cancer, it's not inherited. And there are some kinds of cancer that have a pretty high chance to be inherited, and ovarian is one of them. Probably about somewhere between 20 to 25% of ovarian cancer is inherited. And that's because ovarian cancer could be inherited related to mistakes in BRCA1 and 2, but also related to mistakes in other genes that I'm going to tell you about tonight. Probably about 10% of breast cancer is inherited, and breast and ovarian cancer are sometimes inherited together in a pattern. But most of the time when people get cancer, it's not inherited. And it can be related to a lot of things. And one of the things I notice many women wonder about when they come to talk to me is, why did I get cancer? What caused this in the first place? And so we talk about inheritance because that's generally why people have made an appointment with a genetic counselor. But most of the time when people are getting cancer, it's not because of something that's their fault. There are things in our environment that we're exposed to that we don't have a lot of control over that can cause cancer. There are things in diet and habits, things like smoking and drinking, and those are things that we do have some control over. Those can have something to do with developing cancer. But then a big piece of it is chance. And sometimes people are going to have mistakes in their DNA that are going to accumulate to cause cancer, not because of anything they did and not because of anything they didn't do, but because of chance or bad luck or whatever you want to call that type of issue. And most of the time, people don't deserve to get cancer. Even cancers like lung cancer, which is pretty well associated with smoking cigarettes, we know that chance plays a big part in that as well. And so a person could smoke a lot for their whole life and never get cancer. And that's because by chance, the damage that's happened in their DNA has happened in places that didn't turn out to be very important. And somebody else who had a very healthy lifestyle might end up developing cancer at a very young age. And that may be because even though they don't have a lot of damage in their DNA, the damage that they did have happened in places that were very important. And so chance, even when other things are coming around, chance is still playing a big role in why cancer develops.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I find that so many experts and people who talk about cancer and everything totally ignore nutrition. They'll talk about alcohol, they'll talk about smoking, but they won't talk about nutrition. That is, to me, one of the major causes of cancer. People eating very, very bad stuff for them throughout their lives. You're talking about 50, 60 years of eating fatty meats or not eating any vegetables, not having just generally good nutrition.
Yeah, you make a very good point.
And the doctors don't even study it in medical school.
I know that the hospital where I work, we have a dietitian who works in the cancer center that helps people who are going through cancer change their habits in a better direction. And sometimes people who have cancer also can have issues with their diet. Food can taste really bad when you have chemotherapy, or you can, have your appetite can grow or it can shrink, and these are all issues that can come into play. Exercise is very important in cancer too. We encourage women. Obviously, when you're going through treatment, it can be hard to stay very active, but the more you're able to exercise and move around, we see in studies that this is beneficial. So all of these are things that come into play. But again, we don't want to blame anybody. Nobody has a habit with the intention of saying, I'm going to take up eating bad food because I want to get cancer. Bad food is appealing to us for other reasons. If we look, this is a pie chart that's sort of pointing out a little bit about inherited breast cancer. And so if we look, and I'm going to use the pointer here. Let's see. Oh, now it's not working. That's okay. So BRCA1 and 2, and BRCA1 and 2, they're known as the Brca genes. And I'm going to just mention as an aside that genetics experts, we don't like to call the genes Brca, and that's because the name Brca comes from one of the labs, and it's the name that they give their test, BRCanalysis. And so we correctly describe the genes as BRCA1 and 2, and so when you hear me talking about them that way, we are talking about the Brca genes, but I generally stay away from that term. So BRCA1 and 2 make up a big portion of inherited breast and ovarian cancer, and that's that first big pink wedge. But then there are some other genes that fall in this category. These genes are more rare. You might not have heard of any of these genes, but all of these genes can cause a very high chance for breast cancer, along with different cancers, not breast and ovarian, but maybe breast and uterine, or breast and stomach, or breast and pancreatic, for example. And so nowadays when we test, we don't just think about BRCA1 and 2, we think about some of these other genes as well. And then in this green wedge are some of the more moderate risk genes that could predispose to breast cancer. And those could include genes like ATM is the name of a gene, besides being a place where you might get cash. It's also a cancer predisposition gene. CHEK2 is another gene that causes a more moderate risk. BRIP1 causes a moderate risk of ovarian cancer. So these fall into this category here. But I want you to notice the big dark green that takes up about half. This is other genes that we don't know how to look for yet. And so what I have to tell everybody who comes in to talk to me about inherited cancer is there's still a lot that we don't understand. And the more we have learned, and the more genes that we have on our test, and I can offer women sometimes a test that has as many as 80 genes on it. And so shouldn't 80 genes, shouldn't that be everything? But it turns out that's not everything. This big wedge in the back are all things that we haven't figured out yet. And so if someone has a genetic test and we don't find anything, it may be because it's something that we don't yet know how to look for. And so it's really important when you get a genetic test done to have it interpreted correctly by a genetic counselor. A lot of doctors are smart enough to know how to interpret genetic tests, but some of them really can use some assistance from a genetics expert. And it's really important if you're going to have a genetic test done to make sure you get somebody smart telling you what test to have and what it means when you get the results back. So I can say that, yeah, question?
Is it difficult to get an insurance company to pay for the cost of having the BRCA test done? That's something I heard about, but I didn't know.
So very interestingly, it has become easier to get testing covered. And one of the things I can tell you is just in the last year, the organizations that decide who should qualify for a genetic test have broadened the criteria. And one of the reasons for that is that the test is not so expensive anymore. Now, you know, what things cost for insurance companies and what is actually paid is a very confusing issue. And I don't think we can talk tonight about everything that's broken with insurance companies and what they pay for things.
Consumer Reports has a big thing. If somebody wants to look it up, they have a very
Right.
big thing.
But what I can tell you about genetic testing is that if someone comes to see me and insurance won't cover a test for them, I have a lab, a very reputable lab that's willing to do a very decent sized test for $250. Now I realize $250, that's a lot of money, but it's something that most people, if they really wanted a test done, could try to work into their budget. That's oftentimes what you're paying on a copay for a lot of the medical services that you have. So we try very hard to make sure that anybody who needs a test can get one. Now the insurance companies have criteria, and very often people who need a test are going to meet that criteria. But every once in a while, there are people who don't quite fit the criteria, but still are going to test positive and need that test. We try to cast a very wide net, and I would say only about 5% of the people at the hospital where I work actually test positive. And that's because we have cast a wide net, and we want to make sure that we include just about anyone who might test positive, but there are still going to be some people who won't fit that criteria. In fact, one of the labs did a study this year looking at Medicare. And Medicare's criteria for genetic testing require that you have had cancer yourself. They won't cover you if you just have a strong family history. And this lab felt that this was really not a good sense. And listen, a lot of things Medicare does don't make sense. But they're a bureaucratic behemoth, and it's very hard to change things about Medicare. But they did a study, and they found that people they tested who met the general national criteria for testing but were unaffected had about a 10% chance to test positive. And Medicare's policies are leading to missing many of these people. And this lab is still running this study and allowing people with Medicare to get the test done for free as a part of their study to try to prove this information. So I would say in general about insurance, it's generally pretty easy to get a test covered. And if we can't get it covered, we have other things that we can do to try to help people who want to have a test done.
I would like to ask you,
Sure.
what's the criteria to have a test? Because I went for evaluation, but they all the time they ask me about relatives. And most
Relatives,
of my relatives are killed in the Holocaust. I
Right.
don't know.
so I'm going to get to a slide in just a few minutes that talks about the criteria for testing. The criteria are pretty complex, and so generally it might involve sitting with somebody, a genetic counselor, to help get that test covered. But when people have Ashkenazi, Eastern European Jewish ancestry, and those are very often people who have lost numerous relatives in the Holocaust, most insurance companies are more willing to pay for genetic testing for people with Ashkenazi ancestry because they know the numbers that we know, that 1 in 40 people with Ashkenazi ancestry will have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation.
Wow.
So the criteria are a little bit more forgiving.
I can't read that because this thing is covering it. What does
Yeah,
it
I
say?
don't know that I can do anything about
Sporadic
that, but it
versus
says
inherit- what's
sporadic. It
Yeah,
says
what's the
sporadic
word
versus,
before colorectal?
there's
no
no
There is
word
none.
before
Oh,
colorectal.
okay, all right, thank you.
So this is just a similar chart to the one that I just previously showed you about inherited cancer, but this is related to colon cancer, not to breast and ovarian. And what you see very similarly, most of colon cancer, that's this big wedge, is not inherited. These two little colored wedges here, these are the genes that we know how to look for that are associated with colon cancer. But a lot of colon cancer genes are things we don't know how to look for yet. So a very similar pattern. A lot of progress we still need to make in terms of being able to figure out what's causing cancer in families. So this is why I put off your question, because this is what we're up to now. This is features of cancers with a strong inherited component. And so what makes us suspicious that somebody might need to have a test done? So the first thing we're looking at is early onset. And so if somebody had cancer at a young age, and for breast cancer, insurance companies say 45 and under is really young. And if somebody was diagnosed with breast cancer under age 45, most insurance companies are going to pay for a test regardless of whether there's any family history. Sometimes we look at the specific tumor pathology. And so if someone has a tumor that's triple negative, and that means that the tumor is missing estrogen, progesterone, and HER2 receptors, then that is also an allowance to get testing done. People who have had cancer more than once makes us more suspicious. So if someone had breast cancer on one side and then got it on the other side, so it's happened to them twice, that
What if
makes
they've
us more
had two different
suspicious.
types of cancer? I've had lymphoma and then 12 years later, breast cancer. They're two.
So it depends on the kind of cancer, but some kinds of cancer, and I'm going to get to that on the bottom here, some kinds of cancer like breast and ovarian go together. Sometimes breast and pancreatic might stir our suspicion. Colon and endometrial together stir our suspicion. We're concerned if we see multiple generations affected with cancer. So if we draw out a picture, and genetic counselors always draw a picture of the family tree, we like to see it and see the relationships of the people who've had cancer. And so somebody who has several relatives with the same kind of cancer on one side of the family, that's going to make us suspicious. Sometimes if everybody in one generation has cancer and it's not in multiple generations, it could be related to an exposure. So what if a family grew up, and I'm dating myself by saying love canal, but what if a family grew up in love canal and now they all have cancer? Well,
Where is
maybe
that?
it wasn't because of something inherited.
Love Canal is New York.
Maybe it was because they grew up exposed to toxic chemicals. And so that's another thing to consider. Rare cancers, like men with breast cancer. Men almost never get breast cancer, and when they do, it's a red flag to think about something inherited. Combinations of cancer, which I just mentioned, or people who have unusually large numbers of colon polyps. So if you have a colonoscopy and they take out 1 polyp or 2 polyps, but if you have a bunch of colonoscopies and now you've had 20 or 30 or 40 polyps, that's concerning. And that could be related to something inherited.
You mean continuous throughout the
Accumulated
life.
total amount?
lifetime total number of polyps.
Oh.
Once the lifetime number is over 20,
Oh.
then you're generally going to qualify for a genetic test. Because there are inherited syndromes that cause excess numbers of colon polyps. And then finally, the last thing on the list, which is not written there, so it's not because it's hiding, is Jewish ancestry. And when people have ancestry from Eastern Europe that's Jewish, it jacks up our suspicion. And not just for those of us who work in a Jewish organization, because of course we know this really well, but for all of medicine and genetics. Genetic doctors and specialists also understand the importance of having Jewish ancestry. So these are just pictures. This is how genetic counselors draw family trees. And the circles are women, the squares are men. So here you see a married couple and they have 4 children. And the ones that are filled in are people who've had cancer. And so the one on the left side here, these are made-up families, but they're drawn to show what inherited cancer looks like. So here on the left side, we have a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, all with young breast cancer before age 50, as well as another sister with ovarian cancer. So this is, if somebody comes into my office and their family looks like that, it's kind of a slam dunk. This is what inherited cancer looks like. On the other side, we see only one person with breast cancer at a typical older age. And so if that person came to see me, I would say most likely not inherited. And what I'll tell you is most people who come in to speak to me, their family falls somewhere in the middle. It's usually not such a slam dunk. Sometimes it is, and then I might say to someone, wow, your family looks just like the one we made up to look inherited. We don't need a made-up family. Your family looks pretty bad. But most people's families fall somewhere right in between. And depending on, what the specific criteria are for someone's insurance company, we're going to be able to figure out if they meet the criteria for that particular kind of insurance to get the test paid for. So I'm just going to briefly tell you a little bit about genetics, so you have a bit of an understanding of how we do a genetic test. So our bodies, as you know, are made up of billions and trillions of cells. And all the cells all over our body have a nucleus in them, and inside of that we find the chromosomes. Chromosomes are long structures that carry the genes themselves, and the genes are made up of DNA. And the DNA is that spiral molecule that looks so pretty in anything that's marketed for genetics. It's a beautiful structure. So these are chromosomes. And it appears we are all women here tonight, so all of us, our chromosomes would look pretty much like that. These are chromosomes of a woman, and you can tell because there are 2 X chromosomes, and those are the chromosomes that, that women have. Men have an X and a Y. And the first thing you might notice about these chromosomes is that they're in pairs. See, there's 2 of each one. And that's because we get 1 of each one of our chromosomes from each one of our parents. Half of our DNA is from mom, and half is from dad. And so if someone has a mistake in a cancer predisposition gene, usually they would have gotten it from one of their parents. And I would say, on average, if I had 100 women who had an inherited mutation, I would expect half of them, by chance, would have gotten it from their dad, and the other half would have gotten it from their mom. Now, what can happen with inherited breast and ovarian cancer is you could inherit something on the side of the family where there's a lot of men, and there might not just be any history to be able to see that happening. I happen to be in a family, my father has 1 brother, and his father, my grandfather, had 3 brothers. So if there was something inherited causing breast and ovarian cancer moving through my father's family, there would have been no way for me to ever know about it, because there weren't enough women in that family. And so that's why sometimes someone develops cancer and it seems to, like, wow, this really came out of nowhere. Nobody in the family ever has any cancer. But we might find something inherited because it's been traveling mostly in men. And most of the time in men, when we're talking about inherited breast and ovarian cancer, men rarely get breast cancer and they never get ovarian cancer.
Isn't it also associated with pancreatic and...
Yes. So men do get cancer related to BRCA1 and 2 mutations because the biggest risks are for breast and ovarian, but there are risks for prostate, which women don't get, men get that, and risks for pancreatic cancer, and with BRCA2 a little bit of a risk for melanoma as well. So you're absolutely correct. So each one of those chromosomes carries hundreds to thousands of genes. The genes themselves, the genes that we look at, and Melissa told us earlier that we all have BRCA1 and 2. It turns out that all the cancer predisposition genes work the same way. We all have them, and they are the good guys. And they help prevent cancer in different ways. Some of them do it by controlling how cells grow. Some of it do it by fixing mistakes that happen in the DNA. But whatever way they work, it's a good thing. The job they do is good for us, and it prevents us from getting cancer.
Wait, I'm sorry, could you just repeat that, like, quickly, or?
Yeah, so the genes we look at on the test are all good guys. So we're not looking, there's no such thing as a rogue gene that its only job is to cause cancer in the small number of people who have it. There's no such thing as that. What we're looking for when we do the test is mistakes in the good guys. So it's a mistake in the gene that's protecting us that allows us to have a higher risk for cancer.
Excuse me. I asked you a few minutes ago something, I didn't hear an answer. I wanted to know if there's any correlation between the 2 cancers I had. I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was cured. I consider it cured, not in remission. Some people say it's in remission. It's 12 years. And then last year, I had breast cancer. Now, are those 2 cancers in any way related?
They're not.
Peggy, can I step in for 1 second?
Yeah.
They're not related in a genetic way, just like Peggy just said. But I also had lymphoma, and then I had breast cancer.
Okay.
And very often, breast cancer, a person who's gone through treatment for lymphoma has a higher risk of breast cancer because of the treatment, not because of a genetic thing.
I see, okay.
So, and I had mine 17 years after, my breast cancer 17 years after my lymphoma.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. I didn't
And
know
that can be true often of cancers that are treated with radiation.
Yes, although in the case of lymphoma, it was radiation and 1 of the 4 chemo drugs.
Right.
Yeah, well, I had mostly radiation and 3 sessions of chemo with the lymphoma, But with the lumpectomy, which was stage 1, I didn't need any chemo. It was just radiation, and I'm still losing my hair. My hair comes out and
What I want to ask, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, you probably have personal questions that are going to come up, as did this lady, and I'm happy to answer more personal things at the end. So we'll try to keep our
Okay, I won't ask
questions,
any more questions.
mostly ask lots of questions, but
Save them up.
things that are more personal and specific about your own case, hold them until the end. So when we have mistakes in the genetic world, we don't call them mistakes, we have a special word for it, and we call them mutations. Sometimes mutation has kind of a uncomfortable connotation to people. They think of mutant turtles, something like that.
Yes.
X-Men something. But mutation is really a science word, and it means mistake in the genetics world. And it's having one copy that's not working, a mutation on one of the 2 copies. And remember, you have 2 copies because you got one from each one of your parents. And usually with cancer predisposition, one of the copies is working and the other copy is where the mistake is.
And they can't protect each other?
So when you have something inherited that's predisposing to cancer, at the beginning, the good one is protecting you from the bad one. And that's why people who have one of these inherited mutations don't usually get cancer when they're a child. They don't have cancer as soon as they're born. It generally takes more mistakes than just one. And this is kind of what I want to try to explain with this picture. So here you see, what I generally say when I'm looking at this slide is anybody can get cancer, unfortunately. You don't have to have something inherited. And that's because mistakes happen in our DNA all the time. And those mistakes can gradually accumulate over time. And mistakes in the same line of cells can continue to accumulate. And they'll gradually change the normal cells into cancer cells. And that process, unfortunately, can happen to anybody. But if somebody has something inherited, then in essence, they start out one step ahead on the pathway before they're born. And so they don't have cancer when they're born, but they have that predisposition is there. And that has made this pathway to cancer shorter.
Can I ask a question? Can you explain how people get mutations beyond inheriting from a parent?
So most mutations come by accident. And so one of the ways mutations happen is our cells are constantly dividing. And some of our cells divide more, and some of them divide less. And the more cells divide, the more chance that cancer will happen. So for example, the lining inside of our intestinal tract, those cells have to be replaced on a very, very regular basis because of the wear and tear that food and digestion causes. And so one of the places where we see cancer developing is those cells that are inside the stomach, inside the small intestine, inside the colon, inside the rectum, inside the pancreas, because of that wear and tear. And so as cells are dividing and replacing old cells, the cell has to make a brand new copy of all of the chromosomes. And in the process of copying over, sometimes just typos happen. And there are mistakes there. We have those good guys that try to maintain the integrity of our DNA and fix mistakes, but sometimes they miss things. And that's one of the places where we see errors accumulate. The same thing happens in the breast. We don't think of the breast as a terribly active place, but anybody, if you think about when you're going through your cycle and you know there's that period of time where the breast is active and cells in the breast are responding to estrogen and preparing for you to be pregnant and have a baby. Your body doesn't know that you're not going to be pregnant every single month. You might know that, but your body doesn't know that. And so the hormones are preparing your breasts for pregnancy once a month. And so that constant stimulation of dividing cells and then stopping, that's why we see so much breast cancer. Yeah.
Okay, well, 47 years ago, I had my own child, and I joined La Leche League. I was being discouraged from breastfeeding. It was not popular. Women in the maternity ward were given free formula.
Right.
However, I overcame these objections, and I did it for 6 months. It wasn't, any chore for me. And I felt that my baby was getting a healthy start. Now, what I want to know is this. I've read that later getting cancer in some ways is connected with breastfeeding, and I want to know what studies have shown whether
So-
pro or con.
Studies seem to show that breastfeeding is beneficial to the woman who is breastfeeding. And so we see lower risks for breast cancer and also sometimes lower risks for other cancers like ovarian cancer. And that's because during the time of breastfeeding, that up and down cycle that women go through every month is sort of put on hold while you're breastfeeding, and the other hormones are kind of laying low, and it's the breastfeeding hormones that are predominating, and so generally it's thought to be beneficial. Now, lots of people breastfeed and still get cancer. It's not
Today it's almost.
it's not a magical tool, but it's certainly in the things that we can do to reduce our risk of getting cancer. I think breastfeeding falls on the positive side. But what we don't want to have happen, some people try to breastfeed and it doesn't work out. I talk to a lot of women who say that, and it's not their fault, and it doesn't mean they're going to get cancer. It's just
No, but it's
one of those.
emotional. It's an emotional.
It's one of those things that can have a small impact. So again, somebody could have an inherited mutation. They could start here, one step ahead down the pathway, but just by their good fortune, they never accumulate enough damage in one line of cells to ever get cancer. So sometimes people have an inherited mutation, they go their whole life, they never get cancer. So again, it's one of those things where the genetics is not the whole picture. The exposures, the diet, the breastfeeding, all the things are not the whole picture.
It's almost like winning the lottery.
It's a lot like winning the lottery, except cancer is one you don't want to win.
Not
$1.6
quite.
billion.
Yeah.
Not quite. Yeah.
Okay. So how do we do a genetic test nowadays? So back in the day, we used to do a lot more specific testing. And so I would look very carefully at the family tree and try to think of what is the best gene, the most important one to choose, because chances are the insurance was only going to cover one test, and you had to pick the best test at the outset. Now the good thing that happens nowadays, very often insurance is only going to cover one test, but generally we can get them to cover a big test. And so we can
What
do a
does
test.
it mean, a big test?
A big test is a test that has lots of genes on it. And so, so a specific test is, I'll still offer a specific test to someone. Let's say I have a patient who tests positive. They have a BRCA1 mutation. So now their relatives come in. So I know what's causing the cancer in the family, and I can do a very specific and very inexpensive test to find what we're looking for. A panel test is when we're not sure what we're looking for. We have an idea. We may see, wow, there's breast and ovarian cancer. That makes us think of BRCA1 and 2. But there's also pancreatic cancer, and that could go along, but that could be related to another gene, maybe PALB2. And then there's a case of colon cancer, and sometimes colon and ovarian can be related to something we call Lynch, which is an inherited colon cancer. And so what I can do nowadays is I can pin my test to the criteria for one of these types of inherited cancer. And then once the insurance company is paying for a test, I in essence throw in all the other genes I want to include for free. So it's not really that I'm buying one and getting 30 free, but the cost is so inexpensive. And many of the labs actually charge the same price, whether you look at 2 genes or 83 genes, the price is the same. And that's because the technology has changed so that it's become very inexpensive for a machine to spit out genetic code. And so that part of it has become very inexpensive. And the only part that has really stayed expensive is that you have to have smart people who know how to interpret the code. And the most important thing about going to the correct lab and getting a good test is making sure that you use a lab that is a reputable and good quality.
And you could recommend one for us, right?
I generally don't go around recommending labs, but there is, I would say there's a group of about 5 or 6 labs that are all of very good quality. But if you find a lab on the internet, I would be cautious without getting advice from a genetics expert. And if you go get your test in the first place from a genetics expert, they're only going to offer you a test at one of these better quality labs. Yes?
Do these labs have like an age cutoff where they say, well, this person's too old, so we're not going to do a test for them?
No, they pretty much don't have that. Very often we have to say that there is a medical necessity to have the test done, and so sometimes if someone is very elderly, or more importantly, if they have a terminal illness, it can be hard to make a case that there's a medical necessity there, but most of the time, the labs and the insurance companies are not really pushy about that because they know that it's often better to test the person who has cancer to know what's going on in the family. So, yes.
I would like to ask about nutrition. If you go through healing through nutrition, how is that affected by the genes?
So I have to say I'm not a big expert on nutrition. And what I generally tell women is that it can be really important to use diet to maintain good health when you're going through cancer. But it may not be that we can really cure cancer just by changing nutrition. There probably may need to be other treatments as well. And those are questions you want to ask your doctor, and visit a certified registered dietitian, and they'll be able to give you good advice about diet. But I'm a genetic counselor. I don't really have such good advice about diet other than the things you can probably all think of. So, yeah.
Actually, last night on the news, Channel 2, CBS, they had something where they said that people that ate organic were 25% less likely to get cancer. They did a study on 70,000 people, which is a lot of people, and they saw 25% more likely not to get it.
And that's, probably, we don't think pesticide residues are a good thing for us.
Right.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, sometimes it's people who don't have a lot of money or not able to afford to eat that kind of very good diet.
Right.
And that can be a problem as well. So some of the genes on our panel cause a very high risk of cancer, but some of them cause a more moderate risk. And so depending on what we identify, it's important to know exactly what the risk is for cancer, what you should do differently based on that finding. And all of the genes are not the same as BRCA1 and 2. So if you test positive, we're not automatically saying you need to have your ovaries taken out, because many of the genes on this panel don't have anything to do with ovarian cancer. So all important in terms
Is there one way a natural way to take care? Only surgery?
It's, there really isn't a natural way
Or
that
chemicals.
we know can cure all cancer.
Not all. If there
And
is
so-
a way.
Yeah,
So we can talk a little bit about that in a few slides.
yeah.
Okay.
But again, it's sort of a little bit off what I'm an expert in. So I'm gonna pass again. I'm sorry on that question. So when somebody gets a genetic result back, you might think that there are 2 answers that you will get. You will either get yes, there's something inherited, or no, there is not something inherited. But it turns out that there's a third possible answer. And there actually was just within the last couple of weeks an article about this in the New York Times, which probably most people missed, because I even missed it until somebody pointed it out to me. The third possible answer that we get when we do a genetic test is something uncertain. And that's like getting a maybe answer. And what this means is that when the lab did your test, they found something a little bit different in your DNA. And what's uncertain is not that there was something different there. They're sure they found something different. But what they're not sure of is whether that difference is important or not important. And so when we used to do smaller genetic tests, we would only get about maybe 2 or 3% of the time we would get an uncertain answer. But one of the downsides of doing a very big test that includes a panel is that we now get something uncertain more like 30 or 40% of the time. And it's really a very annoying result to get back because people are looking for an answer. They want to know, yes, this is inherited, or no, this is not inherited. And most of the time, we can't give people that answer. And that's because even with a negative result, and most of the time when I test people, they're going to get a negative result. But if we don't know, if we haven't previously identified a mutation in the family, then when we get a negative result, we have to say that the risk is not fully defined. We don't know if there may be something else that we just don't know how to look for that could be causing cancer in that family. Yeah?
Sorry, I was wondering if a person has the test done at different points in their life, is it possible for that to change, or is it like it's not static necessarily?
So your DNA is static,
Oh.
and that doesn't change. But what changes is the test. So if you had a test, let's say you went in and had a genetic test 10 years ago, you probably got tested for BRCA1 and 2, and you may not have even had a complete BRCA1 and 2 test because the test's technology has gradually been improving over the years. And so you might have a result that's negative now, and then you get retested 10 years later and we find something. And that's usually not because it wasn't there before. It's just that because the technology has now changed and we can find things that we didn't find before. So if you are wondering if you need an upgrade in your genetic test, and a lot of people talk about that now, I get a lot of questions where women say, I had a test in the past, but now my doctor said there's new genes that they look at. Should I do that? And that's a question, I think it can make sense for just about anybody to redo the test. It just is always going to be a question whether that's going to get covered by insurance.
Because the wedges that you showed before, those burgundy wedges of the sort of the unknown, those are going to change,
Right.
in many years from now.
Right, and
that-
so what I would hope is that if I was doing this same lecture 10 years from now, that maybe that unknown wedge would be smaller. And maybe we would know more about some of those genes that we haven't figured out yet. And when I was first in this line of work, I was really mainly testing people for BRCA1 and 2. And now, I used to say there are other genes, and now I know what a lot of them are. So we're making progress, but the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And while the genes that have a big impact are easy to find, it's genes that are more common but have a small impact by themselves that are hard to find because they don't make that much of a difference. If I had a gene that changed my risk of breast cancer from 12% to 12.4%, that's not very exciting. It doesn't mean that much. But if I had 30 of those genes that all added a tiny amount, that could add up. And that's what a lot of the things that we don't know how to look for, that's the kind of mistakes they are. And so we have to change the way we find them. And it takes a lot more technology and statistics and study. But, we're learning, we're making progress. So if someone has an uncertain result, it's possible the lab will reclassify that result over time. So I've had patients who I tell them their result is uncertain, but then I might get a report from the lab 3 years later that says, lo and behold, we have enough evidence to say this is not something to worry about. And so then I pull people up and I say, your result has been reclassified. And usually it's good news. Most of the time when the results are reclassified, it's usually in a good direction to say it's not something to worry about, but we do see it in the other direction, and I did have a patient once who had her finding upgraded. First they said it was uncertain, and then they said, no, this turns out this, we now have enough evidence to say this is something important. So if you have a genetic test and you have an uncertain result, you want to make sure that your genetic counselor has access to your updated contact information. Yeah?
Hi, while there may be a patient having the genetic test, is there anything beneficial to members or two from that patient's family to also have the test done to gather more information from the family?
Very often that's helpful. That's a very good point. Sometimes what the labs will do is they'll offer testing. Let's say we find something uncertain in a family member with breast cancer. And let's say they have a sister who also had breast cancer. So now it could be useful to know, is that uncertain variant also in the sister with breast cancer? And also maybe in the mother who also had breast cancer? So sometimes testing multiple family members to see how the variant tracks with the cancer in the family is part of how the labs try to figure out whether these are important or not. And if you have an uncertain finding, you can talk to your genetic counselor and find out if any of your relatives would be eligible to have that kind of testing done. Yeah.
So the number of mutations is important and the kind of mutation is important? It affects the cancer?
So there are two kinds of mutations that we're talking about, and mostly tonight we've been talking about the inherited kind. And that's the kind that we're born with that could be predisposing to cancer. But every tumor is full of mutations, and that's what caused the cancer to develop in the first place. And so sometimes, especially nowadays, this is very common in cancer treatment, that we do a genetic test not on the patient, but on the tumor. And that's because if we know what the mistakes are that added up to cause the cancer, it may give the doctor a tool to know there's a drug that matches with the mistake that's in the tumor. And one good example of that, which doesn't really apply to what we're talking about now, but we might as well talk about it now that I'm thinking about it, has to do with people who test BRCA positive. And so it turns out if you have a BRCA 1 or 2 mutation, it's not only important in terms of what it means for possibly developing another cancer or for cancer possibly happening in your relatives, but it can also help doctors determine if you're a good candidate for a medication. And there are medications called PARP inhibitors that especially work well to fight cancer, ovarian and breast cancer, and possibly prostate and pancreatic as well. They work particularly well for people who have BRCA 1 or 2 mutations.
And those are ongoing, you take that.
So you take that ongoing. They don't work for everyone, but for some patients, they have proven to extend life significantly longer than would be expected with more typical treatments. And so it's another way in which the guidelines for who should get a genetic test have expanded, because now if someone has metastatic breast cancer or stage 4 advanced cancer that's traveled to other parts of the body, they may be eligible for a genetic test to determine if they should use a PARP inhibitor or not. Yeah.
Well, hardly anybody ever talks about the tumors that are benign. Everybody just assumes if you have a tumor, it's cancer. I'd like to know what percent, I know that my mother had a breast tumor before she gave birth to me, and it was benign. So I'd like to know what percentage of tumors are benign and which percentage are cancerous.
I don't really know the answer to that question. I don't know the number. I know
Because everybody just assumes you have cancer
Right.
if you have a lump in your breast, and that's not
a
true.
fair amount of the time when women need to have a biopsy done, most of the time I think biopsies turn out not to find anything cancerous.
That's what happened to me. It was nothing. It was
Yeah.
like dense breast tissue.
Yeah, a lot of women get biopsies that turn out to be nothing, but I don't know what the percentages are.
Okay.
But it's one of the things that, we rely on the kind of doctor we call a pathologist
Right.
Those are the doctors that look through the microscope at the cells and are able to tell, often by looking at them, whether there's something to
And
worry about or
sometimes a
not.
mistake can be made.
Sometimes
Sometimes they can
pathologists
say
make
it's cancer and
mistakes.
it's not, and the other way around too.
Yeah, sometimes we make mistakes. Absolutely.
I had a biopsy and the result was atypical cells.
Right, and that's very interesting because sometimes there's a result that's not cancer and it's not normal, it's in between. And very often when someone has that kind of a result, doctors may recommend either that in the future you have better screening done, or they might even recommend that you take a medicine like tamoxifen, which is something that normally women with breast cancer take, but a woman with one of these kinds of atypical findings might consider as well. So positive results are important for people in the family. And so if you're carrying one of these mistakes in BRCA1 or 2 or one of the other genes that we're looking at, there would be a 50% chance that you might pass it to the next generation. And that's just because the mistake is there on one of the 2 chromosomes. And so every time that dad has a child, there's a 50-50 chance that child will have the inherited mistake and 50% chance they won't. But the same is like, a good way to think about it is having boys and girls. And some people have kids. I have 2 kids and I ended up getting one of each, one girl and one boy, and that's 50-50. But I'm sure many of you can think of other examples of families that you know where they have 6 kids and they're all boys, or 5 kids and they're all girls. And so 50-50 doesn't mean that half of your kids will be boys and half will be girls. It means each time you have a child, it's a 50-50 chance whether they'll be a boy or a girl. And so the same thing is in terms of something inherited. If there's a 50-50 chance that you passed it to your kids, it's possible all your kids might have inherited it, it's possible none of your kids inherited it, or anything in between.
Well, I have 2 sons, age 22 and 18 now. And when I was first diagnosed, it was 9 years ago. And, we had the Brca test done. So my oldest son, he tested negative.
Mhm.
My youngest son tested positive.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's your 50-50.
Yeah.
That's your 50-50,
yeah.
exactly.
It seemed like with me, it seemed like it skipped a generation because I have an older sister, she's a year older than me. She took the test, she doesn't have the gene, but I do.
Right, right. And that's just, and it's just chance. And there's generally, I would say, pretty much nothing we can do about that. We're going to pass genes on to our kids. And I'm sure you passed a lot of wonderful traits to your sons.
Yeah.
But sometimes you end up passing something that you wish you hadn't. Yeah. Now, there is technology nowadays that allows women to choose whether they pass an inherited mutation to the next generation, and that's using in vitro fertilization. And when you do in vitro fertilization, it's possible for the doctors to take a couple of cells off the embryo and test the embryo and see if it's carrying the mistake or not. This is actually done probably less commonly with BRCA1 and 2 and more commonly with other more serious genetic errors that could be passed on in
My
families.
son just had a baby 7 weeks ago. That was in
Your son had a baby?
Well, he and his wife had a baby. We consider it, he didn't give birth to it, but we consider it a 50-50 thing. And it was not only was it in vitro, but it was also a donated egg.
So there's a lot of amazing technology that's around. And sometimes women will say, listen, I have this inherited mutation and the last thing I want to do is pass it on to the next generation. And so there is technology now that can do that. The problem with the technology, it's not perfect. And so sometimes you don't get any good embryos that don't have the mistake. Sometimes you implant good embryos and they don't take. And other women have said to me, listen, I just can't do this because if my mother had done this, I would have never been born. And a life with a mutation maybe is still, a life worth having. And so, people have strong opinions on both sides, but we try to let people know that this technology is available if it's something they're interested in, yes.
I don't know if you covered this, but like, what do you do if you have the BRCA gene? Like, I mean, Angelina Jolie had both her breasts removed, and it's like,
That
what
is
do
a
you do?
very, very good question, and I think it might be the next slide.
All right.
It is the next slide,
I set
so
you
perfect
up.
timing. I planted that question in the audience ahead of
You
time.
volunteered.
So, what do you do if you end up testing positive? So there are a couple things you consider, but one of the first things people think of is, let me do better screening. And so we have, especially for breast cancer, instead of just having a mammogram or possibly a sonogram, we can offer women who test positive a breast MRI. And a breast MRI is available for really anybody for any number of reasons who has a much higher chance than the average person to develop breast cancer. An MRI is it's not painful, but it's a little bit claustrophobic. Some people have it once and they say, no thank you, I won't do that again, but it's a really great tool to find breast cancer early.
Is it covered?
If there is a reason for it to be done, it will be covered. So there's a calculation that breast specialists know how to do to figure out who should get this test and who shouldn't. And they present that calculation to the insurance company and they make their best case. But usually if someone has an inherited mutation, it's going to be covered, and that's because not only is it the right thing to do, but we have studies that show it's financially beneficial. And that's because if someone actually has breast cancer, that is very expensive for the insurance company. So if they have an opportunity to find it at a very early stage, that's the benefit to the insurance company, and they like things that save them money, even better than the things that just provide good health.
I had many MRIs, but each MRI is different because one of them is for the chest, one is for the lungs, one is
Right, so a breast MRI is very specialized, and it's usually a MRI machine that's dedicated just to breast MRIs. And when you go into a breast MRI, you lay on your stomach, and there are holes in the table that match your breast. And so your breasts dangle down below the table, and that makes the image of a breast MRI look very different than the image from a mammogram. Because a mammogram, you know, the breast is sort of squeezed, squashed between the plates, and so it tends to be a sort of a rounded, even-looking image. But the breast MRI, because the breasts are dangling, sometimes the image has more of a teardrop look, where it's narrower up at the top and then pendulous at the bottom, and that's because of the way the picture is taken. Generally, when you have a breast MRI, there's contrast involved. Some people don't like the contrast, but that's an important part of it. And the tube that you go into is a little bit tight and narrow, and some people find that disturbing.
You mean some people don't like getting the contrast?
Some people don't like getting the contrast.
I get dizzy and high, like when I get like kind of loopy and weak when I get that dye.
Yeah.
So I had it, but I don't remember why I had it.
Yeah. So we're going to go back to surveillance. We kind of got off track a little bit. There are a bunch of cancers listed here that we're good at screening for. But there are some cancers that we're not good at screening for, and this is important to remember. Ovarian cancer, we don't have a good screening test. And if your doctor tells you, I'm going to do a pelvic sonogram and we should be able to see what's going on there, that is not true. And I've talked to many, many women who said, I had a pelvic sonogram, and then 4 months later, they found the ovarian cancer. And I've heard that over and over and over again. And the studies have not been able to prove any benefit for having sonograms or blood tests to prevent ovarian cancer. And so we have one very good tool for preventing ovarian cancer. I'm going to skip that slide first, and that's the surgery. So someone who has the ovaries and tubes taken out before the cancer has a chance to develop, that person has significantly reduced their chance that they'll ever get ovarian cancer. And that's the important message that we have about how we save lives for people for ovarian cancer. And that is by doing a genetic test and trying to identify those women at high risk and then take their ovaries out before they get cancer.
Is there a blood test that you can find out if there's anything?
If there's ovarian cancer,
Yeah.
no, there's not a good blood test for that.
No.
There's a blood test called CA-125, and some doctors will recommend it, but it's really better used for someone who already had ovarian cancer to see if it's coming back. It's not really proven to work to screen for ovarian cancer. And so that's why if someone has a high chance to get ovarian cancer, if we find a high chance on a genetic test, we're going to recommend those women think about getting their ovaries out. Depending on the gene, there are guidelines to what age, and sometimes those ages are, are younger than people want to have their ovaries out. Sometimes we might recommend it in someone as young as between 35 and 40.
May I ask about, I hope I'm not jumping in too far, pancreatic cancer, would that fall under the?
Yeah, so pancreatic cancer falls under that. Some cancers, there's no adequate screening.
Right.
And the problem with pancreatic cancer is really that there's no adequate screening, but you can't really prophylactically remove the pancreas.
Right.
Because you get very sick if you
What do you
do
mean
that.
prophylactically?
So that prophylactic is a word that means that you're trying to prevent something from happening.
Oh.
So
It's not
somebody
something
could say, well, I have a high chance of getting pancreatic cancer, so let me take out my pancreas, even though I think it's healthy.
Like an appendix, you don't really
Right.
need.
So an appendix, you don't really need, and ovaries, at a certain point, you don't need them as much anymore.
Mhm.
And you can live without breasts, but the pancreas is hard to live without.
Oh.
So with the pancreatic, I'm sorry,
Oh, no.
with the pancreatic cancer, you basically have to have the cancer and then the treatment for it.
Yeah, so there are lots of researchers that are working on trying to figure out a good tool to screen for pancreatic cancer.
Oh,
And so if somebody has an increased risk for pancreatic cancer, they may want to get involved in research, because that may be the best way to get some kind of cutting-edge screening test that's not available.
So what is the screening test?
Well, I don't know what it is, because we don't know what it is yet. But if I found out I had a high chance to develop pancreatic cancer, I would go to a center where they might be able to tell me, listen, we can try this test, we can try this test. We're not sure if it's going to work, but this is preliminary evidence. We're trying to prove this, and that may be a good approach to take. Yeah.
Are the cancers that are listed up on the slide, are those the ones that we have to be more diligent about following, making sure we have screenings on?
Yeah, these are all cancers that can be increased in certain inherited syndromes that we're good at screening for. And so if you have an increased risk for one of these, then your doctor's gonna tell you what the screening is that you need to have done.
For many different
Symptoms,
mutations.
sorry, the symptoms for endometrial cancer.
Abnormal vaginal bleeding.
Oh,
So if you go through menopause and you're not bleeding anymore, and then you start bleeding again, that may not be cancer, but you need to go to the doctor right away, just in case. That's another public health factoid that I've learned doing this. So sometimes there are medicines that doctors might recommend that you take to reduce the chance of getting cancer. So we know that medicines like tamoxifen or raloxifene, which is also called Avista, or aromatase inhibitors like Femara or Aromacin, these medications reduce the risk of developing breast cancer. Using birth control pills reduces the risk of getting ovarian cancer. So if someone finds out that when they're young that they're at an increased risk for ovarian cancer, we might recommend they take birth control pills for about 5 years to reduce their risk.
I have a question for the breast cancer drugs up there. Is that mainly for people who may be positive on the estrogen and progesterone, but not necessarily on the HER2 receptor?
So there are two cases here. So here we're not talking about a case where someone has breast cancer and they might need to take one of these medications. Here we're talking about people who don't have cancer, but they have an increased risk to develop it. They could consider taking one of those medications even though they don't have cancer.
Okay.
And that would be, under the auspices of a physician who would weigh the pros and cons of that particular situation. If we find something inherited, it explains some of the cancer in the family. And once we know what we're looking for, it gives us the opportunity to test other people with a straightforward yes or no test. Do I have the mistake or don't I? Without having to have one of those big panels that ends up finding things that are uncertain. So why do people not have a genetic test? Some people worry about their insurance. They're afraid that a genetic test could be called a pre-existing condition. Good thing to know is that's against the law. There was a law passed before the Affordable Care Act called GINA, and it was signed by the second President Bush, that says that your medical insurance can't call a genetic result a pre-existing condition. So your medical insurance is protected. Unfortunately, other insurance is not protected. So a disability or long-term care or life insurance policy that you already have, you're not going to lose. But just like when you get diagnosed with cancer, if you have an inherited mutation, it could make it difficult to buy a new policy because they're allowed to ask questions about that.
So, I was curious to know, what is your thought on getting a mastectomy if you have the Brca gene? Like, I mean, how do you make that decision? Like, it's 88% that you would get it, 88% chance that you would get it?
So the chance that you'll get breast cancer is probably not as high as 88% in everybody who has that mutation. And so it's a complicated decision. Some people who test positive, like the famous Angelina Jolie, do have that big surgery. Lots of other women don't have that surgery. I will tell you that what Angelina Jolie did by publicizing her process by going through this really changed the world of genetic testing and how women thought about it. And I think that's because when I used to tell people that if you tested positive, you might think about having a bilateral mastectomy, they would often gasp in horror and say, oh, I can't even imagine that. But nowadays, when I say that, people say, just like Angelina Jolie. And if a very glamorous person like her could make that choice, then I think regular people like us could as well.
Well, in my family, there were, someone married into my family. There were identical twins who were given that medicine. Their mother was given the medicine when she was pregnant to keep to hold the babies. What was that called, that medicine? In the 1950s and 60s, this medicine was given to thousands of women to say that, you know, if they had a risky pregnancy. Okay, so the twins were born and they were fine. They were beautiful girls. But unfortunately, after they were married, they each had children. After they were married, they both got cancer. One had breast cancer and one had ovarian cancer. And both of them died as a result of their mother taking that medicine.
Yeah, and the name of that medicine has momentarily gone out of my
It's gone out of my mind too, but this is a case where, you know, where the medical community said, this is great, you know, she won't have a miscarriage and this is wonderful. And that's what happened as a result, that they both had cancer and died in their 40s. And the daughter of one of them, who was my cousin, she had the Angelina Jolie thing. Both her mother and her aunts had died, and she went and had it. She didn't, you know, she didn't even think twice about it because she already had her children. She wasn't worried about not having a pregnancy. And she had to have complete replacement, you know, a lot of surgery goes into that. A lot of surgery. She's now in her 50s and she's fine.
So we'll try to wind down. I think the biggest reason that people don't want to have this test done is it scares them.
Yes.
And there are a lot of women that the doctor will say to me, please call Jane Doe, because she has, you know, a strong family history. She needs to think about having this test done. And I call up Jane and she just says, no, I don't want to have this test done, it's too scary. And what I ask women to think about when they're deciding whether or not to have the test done is, how will the test help me make better decisions about my health? And is it possible that I could save my own life or save the life of one of my family members by having this test done? Yes, on the other hand, it may be upsetting to find out you test positive and it causes anxiety. But each woman has to weigh for herself whether she thinks that anxiety is worthwhile for the information that she can possibly gain from the test.
I was happy that I had the test done, and to me it's more scary at not having it done. And then I was thinking about my sons. I was thinking, no, okay, God forbid if I do have the gene, I have to let my sons know, because one day they're gonna have children, and it's better to know. It really is.
And what I often say to women who test positive, and very often the thing that women worry about the most when they test positive is what it means for their kids.
Yeah.
And I just remind people that knowing about it is a gift that you give to your kids, because it gives them the opportunity to make better decisions about their health care. And I think that's really, really
Did you do anything
important.
differently after that? Like, did you, like, when you found out that you had the BRCA gene, did that change you? Like, did you go on medications, or did you do anything differently?
Well, I mean, I had mastectomy on both sides. And like I said, I was first diagnosed 9 years ago with the left breast.
Okay.
I had the mastectomy before I found out that I had the BRCA gene.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, because of the stage that I was in, my doctor, speaking with my doctor, was the best option for me to have the mastectomy.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was saying if I didn't have the mastectomy, if I had the lumpectomy, if it came back, then they wouldn't be able to do anything.
Right.
So I made the decision that yes, mastectomy is the best option for me. Now this was like, I had the chemo, I had radiation. Now I had the BRCA gene, as you know, and last year I still have my right breast, but last year I had to get a mastectomy because my doctor found it, the beginnings of it on that side, so I had to have the mastectomy. So I'm feeling better and less afraid of it now that I know both breasts is on. I'm doing my reconstruction, my implant, so I'm in a good place. But yeah. But that was the choice that I made for me. And the thing is, I had AAA cancer, so my cancer was very aggressive. So I knew that I had to. That was the chance that was the choice that I made. Yeah, but it's been a long road.
In today's paper, it said that very aggressive, they're using immunotherapy now
Yeah.
to combat it. In addition to all the other things they've been using, the newest is the immunotherapy.
So
Your own immune system being used.
So who is using it?
Well, it's the latest, I don't know who, probably Sloan Kettering or people like that.
There are, they're part of what doctors can do now when they're doing those genetic tests on the tumor, is if they can find susceptibility to those medications, and then the immunotherapy does work for some women and some men with cancer. So really winding down here, if your result is negative, that's always really reassuring, and people are very happy when they get a negative result. But it's important to point out that the cancer could still be inherited. It might be related to genes that we don't know how to look for. One of the things we can tell people, if there's no ovarian cancer in your family, just breast cancer, if your result is negative, then most likely your chance to get ovarian cancer is similar to the general population risk. And then if there is a mutation in your family, and then you have a negative result, that's a much more informative negative result. And that means that you likely haven't inherited the risk that we've already identified in the family. Whoops. I think I'm back to
Did you finish everything?
I finished everything I needed to say.
Okay, so.
Thank you.
You're an excellent speaker, thank you.
Thank you. Right, so Peggy gave you a lot of information, a lot of amazing information, and there were a lot of great questions. I want to step away from the nitty-gritty of genetics a little bit and talk about some of the other proactive steps you can take, and also about some of the culturally specific concerns. So, like Peggy mentioned and like some of you mentioned, the decision to get genetic screening is not always an easy one. And there are some issues that are specific to the Jewish community that weigh upon that decision, that help you, that guide you in making that decision. And the first one is, how do I trace my family history? And you alluded to this. So this exact population that we're talking about that has this heightened risk is the exact population that was targeted by the Nazis in Europe in the 40s. And so it may be that you don't know your family history, right? And so that makes it a little bit more difficult. In addition to the political history that impacts your knowledge, the word cancer in general, a couple of generations ago, wasn't spoken about, right? It was whispered. Exactly, it was whispered. And throw the word breast in front of it and you can be sure nobody was talking.
Scandalous.
Right, scandalous. So it may be that you don't know for another reason. And in fact, I've heard women tell me that they've gone back and looked at death certificates of their relatives, and it would say something as simple as women's disease, which could be very relevant in terms of BRCA knowledge. It could be breast or ovarian cancer, but it could be something completely not relevant, so not helpful. You may have trouble with learning your family's cancer history. And there are actually religious and cultural implications of testing depending on how you identify, in what part of the Jewish community you identify. In the more traditional parts of the Jewish community, there's a lot of secrecy surrounding health issues, and I'm sure in other communities as well, surrounding health issues. And it's something that remains a secret, so much so that I've heard over and over again, and I'm sure you have too, that somebody was diagnosed with cancer and in retrospect they found out that their sister had the same cancer, but they never knew. Because of this modesty, it's sometimes called, or secrecy, you may not know about cancer in your family, but also you may worry that you'll be branded if you find out that you have a mutation such as this. And the same issue bears upon communicating this result. So again, a genetic mutation, you have the ability to potentially save relatives' lives. But if cancer is something we don't talk about, you may not know it from someone who's already been tested, or you may feel uncomfortable sharing that information. And then finally, whether you're Jewish or not, these decisions are difficult to make. I believe you just asked, like, once you learn you carry a mutation, how do you make those decisions? So some of the issues that come up that people have to weigh are concern about future fertility and the size of family, which again, in some parts of the Jewish community, not having a large family would be a signal to the outside, to the rest of the community, that there may be a medical issue. So do I take my ovaries earlier or continue to have children and wait longer than the doctor recommends? If I choose to have my breasts removed prophylactically, might that make me a less attractive potential spouse or mate for someone? And so these are issues that for sure lie within the Jewish community, but also beyond it. One of the first things that Peggy said was that only about 10 to 20% of cancers are breast or ovarian cancers are hereditary in nature, which means that 80 to 90% are random occurrences due to exposure, lifestyle, or just bad luck. So whether one carries a BRCA mutation or not, we all have to be responsible for our health. And there are things we can do that will lower our risk. Again, as Peggy said, there's nothing, even surgeries, that reduce our risk down to zero. But there are things that can lower our risk with or without a genetic mutation. And the first thing is knowing family history. So it's important to, if you can, find that out. And You know, we're right, one sec, we're right up against Thanksgiving. Many of you will be getting together with your families. Many of you would probably like to avoid talking about politics. So instead,
Oh, wow.
let's talk about something that could potentially be life-saving, right? Okay.
Oh yeah, you said that there's nothing you can do to prevent it 100%. I thought that getting the ovaries removed or the breast removed would make it 100% so that you wouldn't get it.
It is the most important thing you can do to reduce your risk the most, but nothing is 100%.
Oh, okay.
It's possible that not all the breast tissue would be removed. It's possible, because there's no exact delineation between where breast tissue ends and where other tissue starts. It's possible that cancer could have already been there developing and be hiding in the body somewhere. Is there anything you want to add to that? Or is
Yeah,
that
it's just, nothing is 100%.
Okay.
There are,
Close.
It's close, but I've seen several times in family trees where people knew they tested positive, had their ovaries taken out, and then died of what's called primary peritoneal cancer, which is something very similar to ovarian cancer. And whether it had started previous to the removal of the ovaries or whether it was something that developed later is not clear.
Right.
It's rare, it doesn't usually happen, but nothing in medicine is 100%.
Right.
Exactly. So if you want to take this upcoming holiday to learn more, one of the brochures out there called Your Jewish Genes in the back has a genetic family tree where you can mark information down. The other thing is don't delay routine screenings. So listen, I know there isn't a person in this room who would allow a child or grandchild's lingering cough to go without a visit to the pediatrician. But every day as intelligent adults, we put our own needs at the bottom of our to-do list, right? And I know I need to make that appointment, but I don't have time right now. I know I shouldn't have canceled that screen, whatever it is. We're adults, and we should know what we need to do and follow through on that. Now, I've had a lot of people say, yes, I know, but. And I get that. I really do. I'm going to give you another way to look at this. How will your children, whether they're 3 or 30, know that it's important to care for themselves unless you model that behavior? Right? Our children learn from us no matter how old they are. And so if you're routinely ignoring your own medical needs, it will seem like the normal thing to do for your children or grandchildren.
I had my first colonoscopy 2 months ago, and they found 2 polyps. One was precancerous and one wasn't anything. And they removed both of them and said, come back in 5 years. And I talk about it openly with my whole family because I want them to get screenings, and I make it like the way the C word cancer used to be in the closets. I made it like a subject to talk about.
Good for you, absolutely. Now, for those of you who don't know what your routine screenings are, I suggest that you have a conversation with your healthcare provider. And I'll tell you that the reason I'm telling you to have that conversation and just listen to what you hear on the news is because Jews of Ashkenazi descent are at such higher risk. The recommendations that the government makes don't necessarily apply to us. So you'll learn your family history, you'll know your own health history, you'll have a conversation with your doctor, and together you'll create an individualized screening plan. Right? So it may be that you don't need to start mammograms until 45 or 50, but it may be based on your own personal history or your family's health history that you're going to start them earlier. It may be that you're going to have them more frequently. It may be you'll have different kinds of screenings, right? Not just mammograms, but MRIs, as Peggy was talking about. So what you need to do is create a personalized screening plan for you and then follow that.
What's the difference between mammogram and
an MRI?
No.
Sonogram?
A sonogram. So it's a different way of looking at the breast tissue, and very often that's a very simple thing to add to a mammogram.
But I had open heart surgery, so I cannot have a mammogram. So I do only sonograms.
Right. So
Is that okay?
So you'd have to talk to your doctor about that specifically. If you can't have mammograms, you certainly can't have mammograms. But if you have a concern that a sonogram isn't enough, you could talk to your doctor about maybe doing MRIs, and he or she will have that conversation as to why it's necessary or not necessary. Yes?
How accurate are mammograms, or do you really need to accompany it by a sonogram if you have a risk of it?
Listen, I can't, those are medical decisions, and we definitely can't make that. What I can tell you is that I hear more and more women are having what's known as three-dimensional mammograms, which are now covered by Medicare, which means that it's often a guideline that other insurances use. And it does have a more complete view of the breast tissue. So if you're concerned, that's something to ask your doctor about, and it's not a lot of extra money if for some reason your insurance doesn't cover it.
Medicaid and Medicare covers it?
Medicare does.
Medicare, great.
So, but it's usually only an extra $100 or so if for some reason your insurance doesn't cover it. I've heard stories that mammograms caught somebody's cancer very early. I've heard stories, my own included, that a mammogram thought I was clear and 2 weeks later an MRI caught it. So I think, it depends on a lot of things. But if you have a concern, I really recommend you speak to your doctor about it at the time of the prescription being written. And then you can have an honest conversation about whether that's enough or whether you can take the next step and include a three-dimensional or a sonogram in addition or whatever it is. I think the key here is to really be educated and proactive about your own health. Don't have the mammogram and wonder whether that was really enough. Have the conversation with your doctor so when you have the mammogram, you have faith in it, or when you feel comfortable because you know you've added the three-dimensional element to it, or whatever it is.
I was going to say, you had that statistic of 1 in 8 women will develop breast cancer. And I have a friend who's going to turn 66 in November, and she's never had a mammogram. And I try to tell her, it doesn't hurt. I will come with you. She said, my cousin's a doctor, and she said, if it's not broke, you don't fix it. I'm not going. So I don't.
Okay.
So I'm just saying. So I try to spread the word. It doesn't hurt. I'll go with you. I'll do anything.
Yeah. I think the more we can encourage women and people to be proactive about their own health, the better everybody will be. Okay. Several of you asked about nutrition. So in addition to knowing your family history and following through on your screenings, eating healthfully does make a difference. Again, I'm not asking anybody to go on a very restrictive diet because all the studies show you won't stick to it anyway. So we say eat healthfully most of the time. Have a piece of cake when it's your birthday or when you're celebrating a holiday. But most of the time that you eat, make sure your plate is filled with whole grains and an assorted variety of colors from fruits and vegetables. Limit processed foods where you can. And all the studies show that does impact risk.
Can I ask something
Please.
about the food? The microwave, if you put in the microwave, they said that half of the nutrition is gone.
I don't know about the microwave specifically, but I do know there are certain kinds of foods that fare better nutritionally based on the way they're cooked. So I know that for some vegetables in particular, boiling them takes some of their nutrients out and things like that. So I think it's a food by food basis to move more. Right? I'm not saying that everybody needs to run a marathon, although if you're interested, we do have Team Sharsheret and talk to us about it. But move more. Use it as a way to reconnect. After you're all in a walk, like I live in the suburbs and have to make an effort, but you guys probably move just by virtue of the fact that you live in Manhattan. Yes. But use it as a way, if you don't like walking for the sake of walking, to reconnect. After dinner with a spouse or adult children or whatever. It's a great way to reconnect as well as to get that exercise in. And it's a great way to reduce stress, right? Wherever possible. I think this may be the hardest thing we ask of people, right? We know we need to do it, but it's incredibly difficult in our very busy lives to reduce stress. but stress impacts cancer risk as well. So if you don't have time, well, actually, I saw yoga mats here before, right?
Yes, they have gentle
Right.
yoga in the morning.
So you could come here to do some exercise, or you could go to any number of the 24-hour clubs that dot the city streets here. But for those who can't do that because of physical limitations or time limitations, I actually say one thing that I do all the time, and I travel, so I'm rarely in the same place at the same time, can't join a club for that reason, is just deep, slow breathing. So sometimes I'll realize I've been running around and I can feel that I haven't been breathing evenly or something like that. And what I'll do wherever I am, it's possible, is close my eyes and take 2 very deep, slow breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth. And when I'm done with that, I can actually feel a difference in my body, and I know everybody can when they do that. That's something you can do in a doctor's waiting room, you can do while you're online at the post office, while you're sitting and
On the train.
yeah, on the whatever it is. It's you don't need any equipment, and it does have an impact. And then there is strength in community. Now, I just want to be clear. Whatever your BRCA status is, whatever your relationship to cancer is, whether you're trying to hold it off or you're a cancer thriver and have been through it, there is strength in community, but you have the right to choose whether you want that or not. If you're open about your diagnosis, very often your community will be there to help you with meals and company and a listening ear and rides or whatever it is. But that comes with people asking children or friends or spouse, how is she today, which you may not want. Some people are worried that it may change the way people look at them and think about them, stuff like that. So it's your decision. It's almost like a cost-benefit analysis as to whether or not you want to share that information. But if you do, there can be a lot of strength in community. So one thing, when we do these kind of presentations, we always talk about something that's in the news, and there's always something new in the news. But this has stayed up a while because we get a lot of questions about it, and Peggy alluded to it in a little bit, for a little bit. The government just recently approved what's known as direct-to-consumer testing. It's very simple. You can see these people who are spitting into tubes, and they'll send that off, and their spit will be analyzed for the 3 most common BRCA mutations. And people very often ask us, I mean, I think you asked, where do you get these tests? So people very often ask us about these. And the good news is that the cost of these tests have come down so much that it can be done this way. And awareness about the test's existence, and they've become more available. So those are all the good things that come out of direct-to-consumer testing. In fact, I know, Peggy, you've said that you actually have counseled several women who have already gotten this test and want help interpreting the results. Yeah. And if you've gone to one of these companies, Ancestry, 23andMe, any number of other companies that have that, please do take those results to a genetic counselor to help with interpretation. But a screening such as this really needs to be done within a medical context, right? You need to know beforehand what you're looking for and why you're looking for it. You need to help interpreting the results, right? As Peggy said, a negative result without a mutation doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have more that needs to be done. So that's kind of how we feel about the direct-to-consumer testing. If you've done it, please take it to the results to a genetic counselor. And if that's the way you need to do it for whatever reason, make sure it's done within the context of your health situation before you do it. Speak to your doctor, speak to a genetic counselor. And remember, it's only the three founder mutations or common mutations on BRCA. So if you're concerned that there might be another mutation, this is definitely not the test to do. Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that particular slide?
If you're not Jewish, it's not the test to do.
If you're not Jewish, it's not the test to do, because the three mutations they're looking for are those 3 that are most common within the Ashkenazi community.
But they don't look Jewish.
You never know. You saw that first slide I had with
Yeah,
all the
that's
different
true.
looking Jews? Exactly. Okay, I do want to talk, as we are looking to wrap up, a little bit about Sharsheret and how Sharsheret can help you and people you know. So the best way to think about Sharsheret is two buckets. One is outreach and education, and we do that through events like this, through training healthcare providers, things like that. The other bucket is our clinical bucket, and that is the way we provide support. So I just want to point out that everything that we do at Sharsheret is 100% confidential. In fact, you even have the option of remaining anonymous. We have several callers who have made up names and made up Gmail accounts specifically for this purpose. Everything is 100% individualized. Nobody gets a standard kit. When we talk to you, we learn what your concerns are, what your life experience is, and we really tailor all of our resources to where you are at the particular moment. And then, perhaps most importantly, is nobody pays for any support they get at Sharsheret, and that's very important to us.
What does Sharsheret mean?
Sharsheret's the Hebrew word for chain, and it is actually, as in, we're all links in the chain of support. In fact, our peer support program, we call them links and callers, because we are really all links in that chain. Interestingly enough, in modern Hebrew, Sharsheret is the word that is used for DNA.
That's what I was thinking, DNA.
That has nothing to do with why Sharsheret, the organization, was named Sharsheret, but because it's a chain, and that's what DNA is. And it's actually a good time to point out that Sharsheret provides support to those who have cancer because they have a BRCA or other mutation, and to those who have cancer for any other reason. Our support is not limited to those who are concerned or who have genetic mutations.
Is it only for people with cancer or for...
No, if you have a concern about a genetic mutation, we also have that as well.
And where are you located?
We are a national organization. Our headquarters is in Teaneck, New Jersey, but it's only an administrative headquarters. Our programs have been specifically designed, so whether you live in the middle of Manhattan or in rural Montana, you have equal access to our programs.
So how is that through the
So our
internet?
programs are done through telephone, through webinars, through emails, through the U.S. Postal Service, and you'll see, because we're going to go through our programs, how that works. Okay, so we do have a peer support program, our links and callers. We match people in very interesting ways. So we match people based on their exact diagnosis. So even breast cancer is several different diagnoses with different treatment protocols and things like that. Or perhaps you have ovarian cancer, or perhaps it's the stage that you want to be matched by your stage of life. So are you young and unmarried, an empty nester? Do you have teens or toddlers roaming around your house? Because all of those will impact your cancer experience. And by the way, for the purposes of matching a BRCA, and the identification of heightened risk through a BRCA or other mutation is a way we can match too. If relevant, your connection to Judaism. We really want people to understand, our partners or our peer supporters, to understand one another at a very basic level, because when you have a mutation or a cancer diagnosis, you're constantly explaining yourself to doctors and friends, and we want someone who really understands who you are at the very basic level. We have a Genetics for Life program, and Peggy is the coordinator of that. So in addition to coming out and educating like she did tonight, she takes calls all the time from people who are dipping their toe into it, trying to decide whether the screening is appropriate for them, or have decided to get screening and have questions about it prior. And Peggy will make sure that not only do you have to worry about the BRCA and the medical component, but about the insurance component and things like that. And of course, helping people interpret results afterward. One really amazing thing that Peggy does is we have what we call family conference calls. And if results have come back and you've spoken to her or another genetic counselor, we can arrange to have all of your family members that are appropriate get on a call, and Peggy can explain what the impact is for each person on the call. You know, it's hard to talk about these things because there's an emotional component, and frankly, it's kind of a foreign language for many of us, and we may not understand the ramifications for each person. So having a genetic counselor on the call who's able to do that is really an amazing thing. We have a program that's very specific to the needs of women with ovarian cancer. Our Embrace program is specifically for women facing advanced or metastatic disease. We have a closed Facebook group for people who fall into that category. And we have one particular social worker who offers free weekly counseling to anyone who falls within our Embrace program. Our Busy Box program, one of my favorites, is for families facing cancer, breast or ovarian cancer, while raising young children. So the child gets a box of age-appropriate toys, and we've talked to the parent, and we know whether the child is an athlete or an artist or a reader or is obsessed with trains or whatever it is, and we try and really tailor it. But underneath those toys is an envelope for the parents about how to talk to children in a developmentally appropriate way about cancer and what's going on in the household. Our Family Focus program is for caregivers to teach them how the best way to care for a loved one who's facing an illness or who's facing the prospect of heightened risk, and also allowing them to vent too, making sure that they have the opportunity to vent their fears and frustrations. Our Best Face Forward program helps combat the cosmetic side effects of treatment. Our Thriving Again program is an amazing program that we created with the CDC. It's for cancer survivors, and it's all about moving beyond the initial diagnosis healthfully, both physically and emotionally. So in a binder comes all sorts of healthy living resources, a follow-up care plan to create with a healthcare team, choice of 2 gorgeous healthy living cookbooks and a pedometer, and then the order form has 20 different topics, and you can check whatever topics are of interest to you, and we'll add those to the binder. Everything from fear of reoccurrence to lymphedema to financial issues to talking to children, and so on and so forth. And then we have some of the other things. We have symposia 3 times a year. Our next genetics one is this December. And so if you want to be informed of that, make sure you sign up or you sign in, and we'll make sure that all of you get an email to register for that one if you're interested.
That's like a seminar?
It's a webinar. You log on and you can either listen on the phone or watch on the computer screen. We have an educational series booklet, several of which are out there, which we encourage you to take, including one that was just published about talking to your children about BRCA mutations. So that's a great one. It's not meant for talking to young children, but teens and young adults. And our Sharsheret support programs are partners that we work with to educate and support the community, just like Gilda's Club. And wrapping up, if you wanted more information, you can go on our website and go under BRCA Genetics, and there's all sorts of information.
What's the website?
Sharsheret, www.sharsheret.org, but it's on every single piece of resources that we've shared. And then the last slide, and it's right here actually. But there's one other slide I want to finish with.
I think you went back.
Yeah, I did, right. So we've given you so much information tonight. But just to consider a couple of questions to think about, not to answer here tonight with us, but things for you to think about. Are you ready to make a decision about BRCA screening if you haven't? Have you taken the time to learn your family's history? If not, when is the next time you could ask those important questions? Thanksgiving was what I suggested, but there's plenty of other options. Is it time to speak with your healthcare provider or a genetic counselor? Remember, if you're a doctor who doesn't work with a genetic counselor, or you're not ready to walk yourself into an office to speak with somebody, Peggy is available to answer questions. Do you have any, I shouldn't say colleagues, do you have any friends that would appreciate being introduced to the resources of Sharsheret? And are there any changes you might make based on what you've learned today? Things for you to think about. I know that it's like 3 minutes to 8, and I know we've been asking questions all along, but if any of you have any additional questions, Happy to take them, and of course Peggy and I will stay for a couple minutes in case any of you have a question you wanted to be a little bit more private.
How do you get in touch with Peggy?
So you could call that number and ask to speak to her.
You probably won't get me, but they'll put you in touch
Right,
with me.
right,
I'm
so.
not in the office that often.
Right, but she always gets back to you within 24 hours. So, and then what would happen is you'd set up a time to, you'd schedule a formal conversation with her
On the phone.
on the phone.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming. Don't forget to take the resources, and again, reach out to Sharsheret in general, Peggy in particular, for any way we can help you.
Thank you, and thank you, Melissa and Peggy, both for being here, and to all of you for contributing so thoughtfully to this lecture, and I hope you all get home safely. Thank you.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night.